As is the case with any class, many abilities get heavy reworks, changes, or are outright removed altogether. This can be due to balancing problems, the ability not being fun, or even causing the class to just have too many buttons. And in this video, we're going to be going over some of the removed abilities from the Death Knight class. And at number 10, we have Necrotic Plague. This ability was introduced in the final talent roll slot in Worlds of Draenor. Before players were introduced to the current talent trees of Dragonflight and beyond, Blizzard had opted to simplify the talent trees down, as adding new talents every expansion would give players too much button bloat, and became a balancing nightmare. This change to the talent system was made in Mists of Pandaria, and would instead give you a choice node of 3 talents depending on your current level. You could only unlock one of the talents at a time, and they would swap frequently depending on your specialization. You would have a node at level 15, 30, 45, 60, 75, 90, and 100 during Worlds of Draenor. This is where Necrotic Plague comes in. This final row of talents for level 100 was shared with Defile and Breath of Sindragosa, as at the time, the talents weren't very spec-specific yet, and were more standardized around your actual class, so an Unholy or Blood DK technically could use Breath of Sindragosa. The way Necrotic Plague worked was actually similar to the fight from the Lich King itself during its first phase. He would occasionally mark players with a debuff of the same name, and standing next to the other players with it would infect them, beginning a process of infinitely spreading the plague. The DK ability itself would work very similarly in that it dealt a very small amount of your attack power Shadowfrost damage. It would gradually build up longer for every stack of damage it begins to gain, and would infect nearby enemies of the Death Knight. It would also ultimately replace a Death Knight's Blood Plague and Frost Fever, which were other essential dots needed to complete the DK's rotation for the time, but would function the exact same but now only as a single dot. So this basically means there is less time spent on the GCD and less runes are spent in the process, and if the target lives long enough, the plague would spread indefinitely. The big problem, however, with this dot was that it actually cannot be refreshed and instead just added a stack of the dot itself. This slowed down the rotation of all Death Knights and actually became a significantly lower DPS increase than its counterparts, Breath of Sindragosa and Defile. So it was buffed by 20% damage in patch 6.1 and another 10% in 6.2.3. However, it seems Blizzard never quite hit the mark with this ability, and despite a 30% increase to its total damage, it just never seemed to keep up with Defile and Breath of Sindragosa. So despite being a direct mirror of the Lich King's own ability, it kinda just sucked and was removed from the game after a single expansion, never to be seen again since Legion's release. It finds itself at number 10 for being a pretty interesting way to approach the spread of diseases as a Death Knight for the time. Players wanted the ability to be good, but it just wasn't able to compare sadly, as Defile and Breath continue to exist in the game. Maybe in the future, Blizzard can give it a semi-rework that only belongs to an Unholy Death Knight, as their current iteration very much relies on the spreading of diseases, so it's pretty easy to assume it could come back someday. And at number 9, we have Death Siphon and Conversion. These abilities were added with the rehaul of talent trees in Mists of Pandaria, and were a choice node at level 75 with each other and Death Pact. Conversion worked kinda similarly to how Breath of Sindragosa works currently as a button that would just dump your runic power into a heal over time effect on your character rather than damage. It would change your runic power into health for as long as you had runic power to spend or cancel it yourself. It would heal you for 2% of your max HP every 5 runic power initially, every 5 seconds, but was soon changed to cost 30 runic power per every second for Blood, 10 for Frost, and 20 for Unholy. So it was a bit of a buff and a nerf at the same time, as you would heal more health but spend runic power quicker. All things considered, it was a pretty solid button to self-heal when an opportunity was provided, but the big thing with this button was it was originally a little buggy that made it super OP in PvP. Conversion had a bug where if you made a macro that cast conversions first and then immediately canceled the heal aura placed on yourself, it would allow you to heal as fast as you could press the button, essentially letting a DK in PvP heal for obscene amounts in less than a second. But also its passive effect for as long as you have runic power was really something, as the button was an instant cast at the cost of no runes, so there was no marked downside in pressing it other than your runic power, which was often in abundance. Now for Death Siphon, it was much simpler. You would spend 1 death rune and deal 60% of your attack power as a ranged attack. The damage that the attack does would then heal you for 400% of the damage. And that was all it did, and it made Death Siphon slightly better in PvE situations because if the DK has to heal themselves, at least they can wiggle in some damage on top of it. It did need some buffs to get it going, as it originally only healed for 150% of the damage it dealt, so for a long time, Conversion was the more default choice unless someone wanted Death Pact, which does still exist. Unfortunately, both Conversion and Death Siphon were removed from the game at the start of Legion, and we have not seen them since in any capacity. But in modern WoW, we may never see them as the DK sustainability is already rather strong. And at number 8, we have Hypothermic Presence. This talent was added at the launch of Shadowlands as a talent node in the level 45 section. It shared its row with Gathering Storm and Glacial Advance, at the time, which were significantly stronger AoE options for Frost Death Knights. However, during Shadowlands' run, the absolute strongest build to run at the time was Breath of Sindragosa. Essentially, you would constantly funnel your runic power into a constant frontal cone in front of your character that would last literally as long as you had runic power. So your only job as a Frost Death Knight was just to not lose too much runic power for at least 2 whole minutes, and you'd climb to the top of the damage meters. What Hypothermic Presence does is reduce the cost of all runic power spending abilities by 35% for 8 seconds. It was also completely off the global cooldown, so it could be used at least once every breath, allowing for 8 seconds of easier runic power generation to stay afloat. It was the perfect talent for beginners to the Breath of Sindragosa playstyle, as if you lost your breath uptime before the 2-minute cooldown hit, you'd feel your DPS absolutely plummet, feeding a pretty negative and sometimes degenerate level of play for Frost Death Knights. Thankfully, the talent worked for all runic power abilities, so things like Death Strike, Frost Strike, and Raise Ally would cost significantly less runic power, allowing for a bit more DPS and survivability. This was especially nice in PvP, as it allowed a Death Knight at full runic power to hit many more Death Strikes than normal to keep themselves alive, for whatever reason they may need to. Unfortunately, this talent would be completely outshined by the damage of Gathering Storm, as it almost made your Remorseless Winter nearly infinite with optimal play. This talent was further supported by the Everfrost Conduit, and would often make Remorseless Winter deal nearly as much damage as Breath itself. So the talent wasn't taking a whole lot, but was a great helper for the people learning how the spec was best played. And at number 7, we have Icy Touch. This ability was introduced at the release of the Death Knight class as a whole in Wrath of the Lich King. It would deal a pretty average amount of damage to a target, and then apply the Frost Fever debuff in the process. This debuff would reduce the melee and range attack power speed of the target hit by 14% for 15 seconds. Now, the damage itself of Icy Touch wasn't amazing, so its main use was applying the dot to the enemy. Once applied, it helped enhance a multitude of the rest of the DK's kit back in the day. Things like Blood Strike, Death Strike, and Scourge Strike would all deal more damage based on the amount of diseases you had on the target. It also just naturally made enemies weaker, so there was no actual downsides for it. In patch 3.3 of Wrath, it was semi-changed to cause a high amount of threat while in Frost Presence as a Death Knight. It actually caused so much threat to be generated, it was nearly like its own taunt that dealt damage. So building aggro and single target for Frost tank Death Knights was extremely versatile at the time. This feature was removed at the release of Cataclysm, but it was still an enjoyable part of the class at the time. Truthfully, the button doesn't have much use in current WoW, as a Frost Death Knight can apply the Frost Fever debuff all the same with Howling Blast, but it's such an iconic thing in the DK kit that players have missed it a lot. It's also always nice to have an additional range option as a melee when the time comes. Plus, it gives current Death Knights an actual raid buff again, as reduced casting and melee speed surely helps tanks in the long run. So while it's not super amazing, it gets a spot on the list for its iconism. And at number 6, we have Ghoul Frenzy. This button was almost exclusive to the Unholy Death Knight in Wrath of the Lich King, as it solely benefited a DK's pet. Blood and Frost could have a pet for a limited time, but it was never really sought after for these two specs. What it does is make your current Ghoul pet gain 25% haste for 30 seconds, and it heals for 60% of its health over these 30 seconds. In even shorter terms, that just means the Ghoul is attacking 25% faster for half a minute. This was pretty game-breaking for Unholy, as a majority of their damage before the Morbidity build was solely around their pet's damage. It also didn't get a cooldown until shortly after it was implemented, and would basically give your Ghoul a permanent 25% attack speed buff at the cost of 1 Unholy rune, as the cooldown was only 10 seconds, and the buff itself was 30. So it actually became an integral part of your rotation to ensure your pet is doing as much damage as possible to help carry your weight. It felt pretty novel at the time, and it's a shame it only lasted until Cataclysm. You could argue it basically just became Dark Transformation in the future, but it felt more accurate to the class fantasy of a Necromancer at the time, enhancing your forces at all times while they just absolutely shred in damage. Either way, it's a solid button, especially since you could literally see your Ghoul go crazy after you pressed it, so it's at number 6. And at number 5, we have the original Bone Shield. In the original rendition of Death Knights, Blizzard designed every specialization in mind with the idea that they could all be DPS and tanks. So they were given the tools to do both depending on how you path your talents, and the Unholy's tank reduction ability was Bone Shield in the 8th tier of talent rows. For as long as you had one bone flying around your character, you would take 20% less damage and deal 2% more damage. The only way to lose bones was if you took direct damage from a mob. It would have a 1-minute cooldown and cost 1 Unholy rune when used, meaning you could permanently take 20% less damage and deal 2% more. This already seems pretty overpowered, but it actually used to reduce the damage taken by 40%. That meant if you weren't actually tanking and had this shield active, you constantly were taking 40% less damage compared to the rest of your raid group. They were already insanely tanky on their own, and with additional raid buffs, it made an Unholy DK basically immortal. It's also just super iconic, seeing a Death Knight surrounded by an aura of bone to protect them, which is incredibly thematic, and while it does still technically exist, it can only be used by Blood DKs via Morrowind. Its original rendition allowed for a pretty unique version of the Unholy tanking, but a 40% damage reduction on your DPS spec was the largest draw, and actually ended up making more people DPS as Unholy rather than tank as it. It had to be nerfed pretty often, from reducing the amount of bones, increasing the cooldown, and eventually making it exclusive to only Blood when Cataclysm rolled around, as only Blood could tank when it was released. It was just another testament to how OP Death Knights really were upon their inception, and helped to pave the way to the current renditions of Death Knights that we know today. And at number 4, we have the Power of the Grave and Unholy Aura. These two abilities for DKs were a Death Knight's only true raid buff for a group. The Power of the Grave was added in World of Draenor and would grant all members of your party an increase in their mastery stat. Unholy Aura and Mist of Pandaria would increase the haste of your group by 5% and versatility by 3%. Right away, these buffs were an automatic must-have in literally any group composition, requiring at the very least one Death Knight. The previous iteration of Unholy Aura is straight up just a better Mark of the Wild that Druids have, but if it were ever to be brought back, it would need to be in a nerf state from its previous. These abilities were removed from Death Knights as Blizzard began to prune the raid buffs every single class would bring, as it began to create a strain on what is required in a group. So instead, Blizzard tried to make the uniqueness of Death Knights be their Death Grip, their utility buff which would make them required. Death Grip is definitely one of the best utility buttons in the game, but without it, a Death Knight isn't really all that useful anymore. There's Anti-Magic Zone too, but these are things Vengeance Demon Hunters can just do simply better with Sigil of Chains and Darkness. Perhaps if, or when every class gets their own raid buff, Death Knights can see the return of Power of the Grave or Unholy Aura. As for now, only Death Grip is what makes them stick out. And at number 3, we have Spec Presences. From Wrath of Lich King to the release of Legion, all Death Knights had a stance bar that allowed them to swap between a presence. These presences are better understood as stance dancing, like warriors with battle and defensive stance. It basically just means you would swap mid-fight against either a boss or a player that you would need on the spot. In the case of a Death Knight, you had 3, each presence pertaining to one of the specializations they belong to. In the case of Blood Presence, it would increase your damage by 15% and heal the DK for 4% of any non-dot damage that they would deal. Frost Presence would increase your stamina by 8% and armor contribution from any type of gear by 60%, making you naturally tankier. It also made you generate much more threat with things like Icy Touch, so if you needed to become tankier or even off-tank on the spot, you were able to. Unholy Presence would increase your attack and movement speed by 15% and reduce the global cooldown of all abilities by 0.5 seconds. Basically, it just made you faster, so if you were short of options around mechanics or had a build that needed you to attack faster, Unholy was your way to go. Warriors are still able to perform their stance dances in modern WoW, so maybe Death Knights can one day gain it too. It definitely shouldn't be as good as just a free 15% damage anymore, but it's still fun to have the variety when it's needed in the most dire of situations. And at number 2, we have Corpse Explosion. This ability was added with the release of the Death Knights in Wrath and unfortunately removed in Cataclysm. It did exactly as it sounds and would literally target a corpse and blow it up, dealing damage to all enemies around the corpse. It would not actually cost runes from a Death Knight, but instead their runic power. After you spend the runic power, it tries to look for a nearby corpse and do it as told, dealing large amounts of AoE. And although the tooltip doesn't specifically talk about it, Corpse Explosion could be used on your living ghoul. The explosion would be delayed for 2 seconds, and upon exploding, it would deal far more damage than it was supposed to. Once a corpse was exploded, it would change their model into a pile of disfigured meat and bones, further adding to the grotesque nature of Death Knight's abilities. It actually was meant to have a return in Mist of Pandaria, being designed under the words, detonate the nearest disease-ridden corpse with shadow damage within 15 yards, afflicting them with blood plague and frost fever. An enemy that dies with one or more diseases on it will get the disease-ridden effect. What the disease-ridden effect was supposed to be is unknown, but it's speculated it would be some sort of effect similar to Warlock's Doom Curse, slowly ticking down the demise of an enemy before exploding for a massive amount of damage. Instead, the ability returned into a purely cosmetic variation via Corpse Exploder. But this is a 1.5 minute cooldown and cannot be spammed for the funny visuals of corpse just flying and exploding in all directions so long as the DK has runic power. It certainly could work in modern retail nowadays, at least visually. Maybe Blizzard could change their current epidemic spells into Corpse Explosion variants that makes it so if the target dies to the damage of your epidemic, it either triggers a Corpse Explosion to then damage others, or just visually makes them go pop. It's a largely fan-favorite ability just because of how spectacularly fun it was to get in a group together and use their dead friends to just make them all go over the place. It really is just the depraved nature of Death Knights after all. And at number 1, we have the original Raise Ally ability. In current World of Warcraft, the Raise Ally function is similar to a Druid's Rebirth ability. It can be used in combat to immediately return a fallen friend from your group back to life so they continue to fight as needed. However, originally the ability used to not bring the character themselves back to life and would actually just turn their body into a ghoul. This ghoul would be controlled by the character Rez and had a vehicle type UI appear that directed them what to do. It was part of the introduction to Blizzard's vehicle combat system that was brought in, so you aren't actually your original character at all and are just the ghoul. It had the following abilities: Claw, Thrash, Gnaw, which stunned the target for 3 seconds, Leap, which throws you behind a friend or enemy, Huddle, which reduces all damage from attacks by 50% for 10 seconds, and the Explode button. Explode was the biggest problem with this version of Raise Ally, as when it was cast, it would kill your newfound ghoul, but cause massive amounts of damage to everything around it in the process. It was so bad that you could pull almost a quarter more of a dungeon and have your friend kill nearly everything with just Explode. It also, for whatever reason, was just able to be used in arenas, so a Death Knight could resurrect their friend who was just killed in a 2v2, and then have the ghoul version of them explode and straight up one-shot the enemy. It was super overpowered and took until patch 3.1 for it to not be allowed in arenas in the first place. Death Knights were really the epitome of a hero class, and their kit was one of the strongest to be introduced into the game. The ability to just bring your friend back from the dead and allow them to deal damage in a new way was so novel and fun at the same time. It would likely never be able to return to WoW in its modern form, but it doesn't stop the fun memories it created of watching your friend run up to a boss as a ghoul and just bomb them in the process. Alright, and that's the video. Are there any other removed Death Knight abilities you may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, let us know down in the comments below.